Soy Francisco Ortega, socio senior de McKinsey, managing partner de McKinsey para América Latina de habla hispana. Es un gran placer y un gusto darles la bienvenida y agradecerles por acompañarnos en esta primera sesión de McKinsey Talks, que es nuestra primera temporada, si quieren, de diálogos que en tiempos de disrupción de la pandemia que está llegando a nuestra región, nos parecía muy importante tener un espacio para poder escuchar a los principales pensadores de nuestra firma sobre el contexto actual y sobre todo el contexto futuro, como también a líderes de nuestra región, de distintas industrias y de distintos países, que nos compartan insights y cómo ellos están pensando y ellas están pensando cada uno de los desafíos del hoy y del mañana. Para mí es un gran placer en esta primera edición contar con Sven Smit. Sven es el chairman de McKinsey Global Institute. MGI es nuestro think tank, uno de los principales y más prestigiosos think tanks en el mundo. Es socio senior, Sven, y sobre todas las cosas es un gran amigo de nuestra región, ha estado en varios de nuestros países muchas veces, así que es un gran placer poder contar con él hoy. Voy a cambiar ahora al inglés para fluir el diálogo con Sven. So, Sven, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. We have over 150 leaders of our region joining us today. So, Sven, we are in time of coronavirus. The pandemic is arriving to our region. We are in the first weeks of the lockdown. You have written an article that has enormous impact about how to think our this situation and how to protect our lives and our livelihood. So, if you can, as a starter, give us introduce us to your main thoughts, on this context of this in these unprecedented times.
Thank you, Paco, and it's great to connect with Spanish-speaking Latam and all the countries. I know you are dealing with this event already in many, many ways. Here in Europe, where I live, the virus has gotten closer. Of course, this started in Asia, but in Europe, it's now so close that everybody knows people that have corona, everybody knows people that are in hospital, and many people know people that died. And so this is first and foremost a humanitarian crisis that is affecting the lives of people. And I'm full well aware that that's on your minds. You're caring about your people, you're caring about the people that work for you. And that's where all of this starts. And we've been looking at, how can you in this moment of great uncertainty about how the virus spreads, how adequate our measures are to prevent the spreading, how adequate our measures are to treat the people that are ill. How well is that going? What is the range of uncertainty on the health side? But what we increasingly have also seen over the last weeks is just the enormity of the economic impact of what happens when you lock down a country, when you shelter in place, when you take physical distance, and what happens to the mind of people in terms of their purchase behavior and just all kinds of other behaviors. And that shock is very big. And in that context, governments then have started to launch lots of support measures on the economic side to protect people and businesses. And in that space, we have drawn up a set of scenarios. And on the viral side, we think about 3 levels of duration, let's call it that way. The examples of the Asian countries, the early Asian countries, whether that's Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, or China, is it takes 2 to 3 months to lock down and start opening up. It's a bit varied, but it's an intense lockdown for 2 to 3 months to get the virus over the peak and back down to be comfortable to open up. And what I remind, and this is not well understood enough, even in Europe and the US, that the opening up in China, in Korea, is cautious. And cautious means significant chunks of the economy don't work at full capacity. So this thing is not, you're over, after 2 months, the virus is still around because we haven't found a cure or a treatment yet. And so you need to be cautious to prevent this thing to come back. And I can come back to just the intensity of those protocols later. The second level would be this lasts longer, could be in the Western world than the way the Chinese and the Koreans did this. And it keeps coming back a little bit regionally. That would be a not so good case for the virus. And the third case, which we call it the bad case on the virus, would mean that we basically don't find a way to fully lock down and suppress the virus, and it keeps coming back. You get a second peak and all that kind of stuff. And basically we have to wait until there is a vaccine, which is 12 to 18 months out, and or a treatment, which may be 6 to 12 months out. And then, the virus could get more freedom because we can treat when people get ill. So that's the range. The leading indicator on this is very much the number of people going into hospital requiring critical care, because that hits the hospital bottleneck of the ICUs. And the good news is that number has come down in the early Asian countries. But the good news is this number has come down in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the Scandinavian countries, and it has come down in New York. In New York, it's still 2 days from a plateau, so you don't know whether the plateau comes back. But in Italy, it's seriously down. In Spain, it's seriously down, which tells us that the Western-style lockdowns, which were less intense than the Asian ones, and less tested and less traced, work. What we don't know yet is how long it will take until they're fully down so you can reopen. So they could be in the second scenario or in the first scenario, we don't know yet. But the good news is the lockdowns work to suppress the virus. Now, if you then go, what happens to people that operate in lockdown in terms of the economic behavior, what we find is that 40 to 50% of discretionary spend goes away. People don't buy cars, of course they don't fly, they don't travel, they don't buy expensive equipment. Maybe they do buy some communication equipment because they need to connect. But large chunks of the economy are, not considered anymore as something that people do. The size of that is that 40 to 50% of discretionary spend going away. If you then add that imports-exports jitter, and you add that investment jitters, you can see an economic shock to the tune of 8 to 13% of GDP. And that is the largest shock since World War II, and it's also larger than the first quarter of the Great Depression. And of course, as a consequence, governments have launched massive stimulus actions, massive. Germany even went for 10%. The US, if you add it all up, is 30%, supporting businesses, supporting people. But is that going to work? Because it's a lot of money. It compensates for the entire drop. Maybe we'd be growing. Well, the reality is, if you give somebody $1,000 or $3,000 for a family when they don't have a job, are they going to spend it or are they going to save it? And what we see is they're actually saving it. In China, the young people started to save, which they never did, because they'd learned there's a risk in life, in this case, Corona. And so you need to think about these scenarios of the 3 levels of the virus and then the effectiveness of the economic response. Is it going to be effective, partially effective, or ineffective? And in that box, that is then a 9-box matrix, we come with 2 central scenarios. One is what we call A3, is you go down 10 and it takes 6 to 8 months to get back up. Or you go down 10, which is A1, and it takes 2 to 3 years to go back up. We yesterday finished a poll that is published today, and the majority of the people, leaders in the world, choose A1 as the primary, their first choice scenario, and A3 as the second. They get together 56% of the vote. So 36% of the people, leaders in the world, believe we'll go down 10 and it takes 3 years to go back up.
Wow. Well, it's a very clearly complex scenario, right?
Yeah.
And that will test us all around the world. Now, in the article, you comment a bit on some recommendations on how to behave and act on both imperatives, right? That would allow us to give us some leeway. So can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, so if you think about the imperative of saving lives, what the world is doing is, converging. Everybody is doing forms of lockdown, social distancing, and so on to make sure that the virus doesn't spread. Everybody's working on the capacity of the hospitals to deal with the situation. So more ventilators, more breathing machines, more ICUs, more nurses, more doctors, and all that stuff to be able to treat more patients, which means that if the virus continues to spread, we actually have the capacity to deal with it. And there's the race for cures and treatments. And as I said, you know, the cure, the vaccine might be 12 to 18 months out, the cure 6 to 12. But the wild card I hear is that the cure might be earlier. That would be nice. But then if you look at the economy, all the stimulus is working, which is, you know, debt is being rolled over, people that are furloughed get money, unemployed get unemployment benefits that normally wouldn't have been given in conservative governments and so on. So all that kind of stuff is happening. But there's something else that's very important, which I consider the leading indicator on whether the economy will be back. And that is whether people have the feeling that their lives will be back, that their livelihoods will be back, that their jobs are back. And the strange thing is, we today live in a world where at the one end, doctors can work in a hospital, which are very dangerous because it's infectious everywhere. They wear suits and have protocols and procedure that makes it work. The milk factory runs with procedure, the pharma factory runs, the police runs, the firemen work. Strangely enough, with protocol and procedure, they can work. We can even go to the supermarket, standing in line on a distance. But then all kinds of other things, like going to an office, going to a theater, going to a restaurant, and many, many other things, it's not okay at the moment. And what we will have to work towards is to have a protocol to get back to work in every single walk of life. In addition, everybody's working on testing, both corona and antibody. Everybody's working on a form of tracing, finding the one that will work in the Western world. You know, that's going to be a little controversial here and there. So that's also being done. And to me, it's good on the leading indicator on that is when I talked to governments 4 weeks ago in the US and Europe, hardly anyone was thinking about how to go back to work. Now it's a prime minister issue. The Italian prime minister, the Austrian prime minister, the Spanish prime minister, the Canadian prime ministers, they're all talking about how do we live with the virus? Because the assumption has to be, until we have a cure or a treatment, we're going to live with this virus. And it has the tendency to come back. And then the other one to highlight is that CEOs, 2 weeks ago, not one was writing protocols for their companies on how to go back in some of the tasks that they weren't doing. This week, 70% of the CEOs I talked to are actually busy doing that. Can I go back to office? How can I go back to this? How can I do this? So what I also observe in these times is that 3 months happen in two days. Every 2 days, another 3 months passes. I don't know how you feel, but that speed is just amazing.
Well, you know, it's in Latin America, we are entering right into the lockdown. We are into the first 2 or 3 weeks. And it's interesting to see that the countries and the difference between the countries, but clearly, as you were mentioning, the curve, we're trying to avoid the peak of the curve or delay it as much as possible. But we do see, you know, that all corporations and public sector have responded first by looking after their people. And only after that, they're clearly now thinking on how to adjust their businesses, right? Their supply chains and their operations, getting some stability, and also adjusting and thinking on how to adapt to the new demand levels, right? And what would be the new operation in the future. In your article, you comment a little bit on, or you just mentioned, right, some of the protocols that you think in different industries. What we have been seeing, can you maybe give more detail on that?
Yeah, both China, Korea, Japan, and so on give some insights, but there's also early insights from Europe, how people are thinking about this. So in a way, all these protocols think about separating people, separating segments of the population, and finding protection and distance, if you look at it, and add hygiene. So What I'm sure is hygiene measures will stay, washing hands in every job and so on, regularly and so on. That will have to stay for a long time. But at the moment, we work on what I would call individual separation. So individuals should keep distance. What the Chinese and the Koreans are working on is what's called community separation. So in a factory, you work in groups of 20. They actually are close, but if one person gets ill, that group goes out and goes into quarantine again. The other one is a large factory in China has basically tested all 30,000 employees, and they are on site. This is only something you can do in China, but they're on site for 4 months. And then they go off and they get tested again, and they're on site for 4 months with dormitories around it. I'm not saying that that's the ideal solution, but what they're doing is they're separating groups. So, and then, on the population side, people are now thinking in Europe very seriously whether young kids should go back to school. They might even then get infected, but they can sustain it. So that's a discussion that's being had. People are discussing, should the older people stay home or the high-risk groups stay home, while the non-high-risk groups could go and get some immunity. And then there's tracing and testing. So when you find that somebody's ill, test it and then find who in contact they were, and they need to go back into quarantine. All those things together hopefully produce a cocktail that brings this contagion down to a level that we can deal with it, and we can deal with it in the hospitals too from a capacity perspective. And many of these factors are being done, but the one thing that I want to impress, and from conversation in Europe and the US, it's not fully understood just how intense these measures are.
When you were commenting on the experience in China, what about Europe, in particular businesses, right? How they're responding now in the middle of the situation?
Now, first of all, the outcome per type of business is very different. Now, airlines are in a near standstill, while some of the health companies are like 200% up. So the range is really strange, and food companies are up. Discretionary, of course, is down. So the spread of experiences of companies is very large. The thing that I want to give a heads up on, and I'm sure this will come to Latam soon, is that strange things are happening. Let me give you 3 examples of strange things. So if you are in a company that can help the health crisis, you might get a question from the government to sit together with your competitors and find a solution. Sharing data and information and IT that you were never allowed to share, but now they ask you to share. If you're in an industry that is in real trouble, you might get a call suggesting the path to nationalization or supporting the people with big furloughs. This has happened. There are people that are really reconsidering how they support society in a very intense way. First and foremost, because that's what they want to do, and they use their profits to do so. But do not underestimate that how you behave in the coming months will be how you will be reckoned with after this event. The size of this event and the level of carnage, let's say, that's associated with it, at some point could ricochet in a blame game. What did you do? How did you help? And not dealing with that on time is an issue too. And so we start to see companies increasingly dealing with a wide range of issues far beyond dealing with the immediate crisis. So the immediate crisis is supply chain, keep your people safe, work from home, deal with your customers, deal with your communities, and so on. And everybody set up a team to get that done. There's big issues in supply chain, don't get me wrong. There's big issues in how you do all of this right. But increasingly, I see companies adding an effort to plan ahead for all the things that are still to come, which will be pretty wild given the size of this event.
Well, connected to what you're commenting, some of the concrete actions that we are seeing in Latin America, right, on the response of many companies. Initially, we are obviously starting on the process, so concrete actions we've seen is on how first to respond, right? How to structure, to think if the business will continue into the operation during the lockdown or not, and how the future looks like. Also, some concrete actions that we've seen is, to start building, the scenarios going forward, particularly to include also not only the outcomes that you said that could be very complex, but also to include some of the learnings that are happening today in many institutions. Many institutions are recognizing, to that some by having to go into lockdown, they have done the exercise of how it's the critical minimum people needed, to operate, and how really you can run businesses and run meetings apart, right? And what is the real maximum level of efficiency that we can operate. So that's part of the business that we are seeing on some of the initial reactions here. There's a big effort today in the region of rethinking the ongoing projects, right? The ongoing efforts that are particularly thinking on reimagining the future. As you said, industries will be in many cases transforming at a faster speed than we thought. Sven, if you agree, maybe we'd like to start taking some questions from the...
Sure.
So I got a first question is, my organization has been fully focused in crisis management. What do we need to do to win after the recovery?
Yeah, so it is a very good question, and I get the question a lot. I would think about doing something today which has to do with winning after the recovery. I think a lot of people say it would be good if I know how the world will look, in a new normal in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 from now, whatever the time frame. I think we will only gradually walk into that new normal. A few things we know. Certain things that we were already planning for the future are happening much faster. Telemedicine was a very low number. It has gone to 70% in many places from nothing over FaceTime, not or something like that. But the speed has just been enormous. So digitization, telecommunication companies talk about digital only and so the whole digital transformation, the online transformation is just going faster. And I think that's going to stay. It might bounce back a little bit, but there's a lot of it that will stay because we're learning that this is good behavior and it actually is good experience. On some other things, I think resilience will be thought through differently. How do you think about your supply chains? How do you think about what's the proper stock level and all that kind of stuff? So that will change, I think. But there will be new things, completely new behaviors that I don't think we will know yet. And depending on the duration of the crisis, the size of the behavioral shift will be different. If we go back in 3 months, we probably will forget about it, roughly. If we go back in seriousness in 2 years, during those 2 years, we'll get new habits. Then 2 years, you won't take public transport because that's too crowded, or you will take it only with a mask or something like that. And then, cars might be a good thing. But if it lasts 3 months, public transport could be back. Yeah. And so I think the duration of the recovery actually matters to this, and that you need to study and watch. I also believe that many industries will be not restructured, but reconstructed. So they will both restructure, but also rebuild something towards that future. And since that future is not 100% known, what I would do is you have to up your experimentation. Early on, understand. Now, let me give you one strange one. In China, architects are now working on apartments that are less noisy for neighbors. Because after 6 months being locked down and tied to each other, people are really getting irritated about the noise. It's strange, but I don't think that stuff you make up by doing a brainstorm. You have to study what's happening, and these behaviors will continue to shift. And little things like this are just illustrations of stuff that will happen. It will be big and small, but I would view it as a learning journey where you try to look ahead as far as possible, but also in the near term, so that you can grow with the shifted behavior. If you start to study, will telemedicine be 50 or 70% in the new normal? Well, today it's shifting 10% a month and you're not on it. You won't ever get to the 50 to 70. So you got to go with the shift that's happening today also, recognizing that not all of them will be profitable, by the way.
Thank you, Sven. It's very interesting because it shows the criticality of agile organizations, right? How to very quickly respond to these changes that happen on a monthly basis. Second question, a couple of questions here that is somehow similar. It is, in Latin America, we have, some social tensions, right, and level of poverty in different countries vary, but it's always on high levels. How do you manage to, adapt, let's say, the recovery? What do you suggest in the context of Latin America, of more poor countries? In particular, one of the questions says here, how do you buy social peace in poor countries without resources to make large transfers to the most needed? So how do we think in general in Latin America, we have a different context, a little bit different?
These tensions are big. And why are these tensions existing? Just to be clear, some of these tensions exist in the United States too, and Europe. So some companies actually up their security levels because they're starting to get afraid of what happens when the tension gets too big. So it's not a zero event. I know it's bigger in Latam and in India and Africa and so on, but it's not zero in Europe and US. And what it is if you think about Europe and US, and then I'll go to Latam quickly, a large chunk of the population in Europe and US has basically 6 to 8 weeks in cash besides their debts. So if this event is longer and you're a waiter and you have no work, how is this going to work? Am I comfortable that I will get support for a long time? Now, if you go to Latam and India, the amount of money the governments can pump is going to be a little less. And the duration of cash on hand for a chunk of the population is much shorter. I was talking to a group in India, and they were talking about a large group that basically has 2 days of cash in hand. So if your lockdown is 3 weeks, you're basically discussing how long they can do without food, or group kitchens, or and I do think this is a time where it's not just a market that can decide. We will have to recognize this tension and care more and disproportionately more for those that will be, affected more with their jobs. And I think governments are probably oriented towards that, but some of them are non-voters. So it's complex. But I think as a company, in hindsight, if you didn't do it, you will be reckoned with. That's my basic hypothesis. So it's not just reputation. Like in the past, greenwashing your annual report, I don't think will cut it in these times. Like, social washing your actions. I don't think, we were social. And I've seen people do very serious stuff. Let me give you an example. There was a global consumer company that basically had no travel budget left because nobody's traveling. And instead of using it as a saving and take it to profit, what they did is they said to all their countries, keep the budget and make a donation. I found that a symbolic but also real thing, because it was about real money. And I found it very practical also. You earmark the money according to the travel, and then, let people do a donation. And that is something that scales to the size of that company. And I think we will have to think about that a lot as leaders, because the tension is just a reflection of just how poor these people are.
Yeah, very insightful. Thank you, Sven. Another question. If you look at companies, that have come better than competitors in crisis, throughout the crisis in history, is there any highlight or any differentiation or any pattern that has made them win over this type of severe crisis?
Yeah, so there have been 3 markers that we looked at that came out. One is balance sheets matter. If there's unpredictability, the only security is balance sheet. Because at the end of the day, that means when you need to go to the debt markets and all that kind of stuff. And what we saw is that the companies were more resilient to crisis, dealt with their balance sheet fast. Because as the shock progresses, the closer you get to the real shock, the window closes. So balance sheet matters like no tomorrow, whether you're a bank or a normal company. Then if you have the balance sheet, we found that the people that reflected reality in their moves early, not necessarily at full scale, but started to participate and therefore learn, did better. So they didn't ignore what was happening, but they moved with what was happening. And because of the learning, they then became more agile to move with where the next flows were. And as a result, you could find that they, during the crisis, had higher growth that then extended post-growth. And at the same time, they didn't wait with cost. Now, in this moment, I think, because of what I just said about the social tension stuff, I think you have to do cost in a humane way. But if digital only is the trend, you can't say, well, let's not do digital only because it's going to save cost and it's going to lead to people without work. What you then have to do is, what are these people going to do? So you solve the two problems. That's the social side of this thing, that you have to solve the two problems. But not facing the cost issue is going to just over time eat into the balance sheet that might be good, you know, and then it just, at some point, it just doesn't work.
Okay, thank you, Sven. Another question. This, you know, it says, how do we see supply chains evolving? Is there a normalization of what was in the past, or this current situation of disruption will maintain?
Yeah, so I think there are two angles at this question. It's a very important question. Many people ask them also, will globalization break, or, you know, all that, that's in the same vein.
Yeah, I guess that's something
I just wanted to say, I just wanted to say that globalization had, in the traditional way, had stopped already before the crisis. 8 years before the crisis, global trade was no longer growing faster than GDP. There was still growth, but it was the same as GDP. And that was the earmark of globalization, was trade. And trade had gone more regional. Other things went way more global, which is ideas, communication, interconnection between societies, kids on Facebook and so on. All of that went more global. When I look at the current event, of course, supply chains are strained, but it's not only because we don't want stuff from China. We actually do want stuff from China. Many of the mouth caps now that come into the US come from China. Yes. Yeah? So what's needed will get done. I'm fairly sure about that. What people will be doing more is stress testing their supply chain and figuring out whether they can have single points of failure. Let me give you an example. The automotive industry in China has a single point of failure in Italy. So while they have demand, they can't produce because Italy is in lockdown. And so I think people will be checking for single point of failure and try to see, can you prevent that? Yes, there will be some blame game going around here that maybe you will say you were wrong, and therefore, but at the end of the day, this was a virus getting at all of us. So I would hope that some of the collaboration that's actually happening, even globally right now, it sounds different than it is actually. The WHO, which is in the news today, is actually working on common standards for ventilators for poor countries, so that we can produce them cheaply. So it's not zero collaboration that's happening right now, although, you know, in tough times, there's tension. I'm not convinced that we will go to, you know, a complete global separation of supply chain, but we will be more careful in terms of risk managing our supply chain.
I remember to everyone that you can send questions through the chat to the Q&A, and we will be here to Sven. Another question. When there will be a clear view in terms of timing, right? When there will be a clear view on the right strategies? So as example, Swedish laissez-faire model.
So this I think is also a very interesting question. So I get a lot of questions like, Sven's great that you give me these scenarios, but which one is it? That would be just a lot easier. Yeah? Yes. Because then I'll just plan for that one. It's easier to take the bad one or the good one and I'll just run with it. Yeah. Because I can't plan 2 production levels. I can only plan 1 production level. And I think that's a fair question, a fair challenge to the people that think about scenarios. I think I use the scenarios in the following way, is that I'm robust as a company against multiple scenarios, but at any moment in time, I'm in one frame. That's the first point to say. Now, then the question is, when can I know which frame I'm in? And I would say the 2 signals to look at is, I'm now comfortable that in most countries that have gone through the peak, so Latam is still to come and coming through the peak and so on, we kind of know that we will get down and we will open up. What we don't know is how much of the economy will open up and how much resurgence of the virus we get. And I would look across the summer, if by the opening up that might happen pre-summer, I have to believe stuff will happen in May, stuff will happen in June, schools will probably open for a few weeks and then close again for the summer holidays or something. If we then learn with all the measures that we then do that the virus doesn't resurge very quickly in the Western world again, like it hasn't done in Asia, we will continue to open up and we'll continue to learn. And in the meantime, an amazing amount of innovation will add hospital capacity, which means we can deal with more virus. We'll get closer to treatment, and we will get all kinds of things that we learn together. And then we get through it. If you see us getting difficulty of opening up during the summer, and so you see the difficulty of opening up in September, October, then so much will break in the rest of the economy, no matter what support governments give, that it will take lasting effects into more years. And then you're more into the A1 world. That's how I would look at it. I can't say it now, but it will clarify to some degree in the next few months. Also because the treatment discussion is a few months out from a wildcard perspective.
Very interesting, Sven. Another question. What are some highlights, positive outcomes we have seen from this? How will the world be better after this?
Yeah. So here's my great optimism, and I'll do it by a prediction 3 years out. And, you know, this is personal, it's not McKinsey. But my personal prediction is when we look back in a few years on this event, we will say to each other that we experienced a 1 in 60 viral event, 1 in 60 years, and a 1 in 100-year economic event. And we did a job pretty well. Today, when we're in the middle of it, it feels painful, it feels chaotic. But if you imagine that this is of the size of an economic shock of World War II and the beginning of the Great Depression, if you add to that we're doing the Spanish flu type stuff in addition to it, and we are actually getting this under control in 2 years. Let's say that that's the time frame. We will look back in 4 years and say, job well done. And one of the reasons why we might get there is just because of the size of the innovation and collaboration. What I find super unique about this moment is what I said, the 3 months happening in 2 days from an innovation perspective and from a collective learning perspective. Everybody's talking to each other across sectors, across government and business, all layers of society. And in that conversation, we're innovating to deal with this problem. And I make this joke that if we could keep 10% of the innovation speed that we have now for our lives after this crisis, continued miracles will happen. That to me is the positive, the sheer innovation speed. Where that innovation speed will take us, I don't know. But I think that our expectations for health will be higher. I don't think people can do a 10-year approval for a pill anymore, which means that we might have more cures for other diseases too, and we'll have healthier lives. This digital stuff maybe allows us to be more with our families. And maybe we'll also learn how to not do too many of these things per day and actually be with our families. And so I think lots of beautiful things can happen on the back of what is the largest innovation engine ever launched on this planet.
Last 2 questions. One here is short. As you mentioned that there's some behavioral protocols to go back to work, right? One question here says, is age the right parameter to allow people back to work? And in concrete, you know, should they discriminate between ages?
So I don't want to give that's the answer. There is something about risk groups. And the Swedish experiment is the following. What they do is they communicate to people, these are the high risk groups. It's your choice whether you go into the danger or not. But they have schools are still open and they have certain parts of work, more of the jobs are still open. And they basically put it on the individuals. I'm not saying if you take the risk that you put yourself in harm's way, if you're a high risk group, you know, versus being home, how does that conversation go? And I think there will be a Western world way of doing this and early Asian country way of doing this. In the early Asian countries, there's more of this. And you'll see some countries experiment with saying everybody north of 60 or 70 should stay home, and whether that's own responsibility or a little bit more forced, we'll see.
Sven, final thoughts on these 5 minutes. This one, just to remember that on your last article, you know, getting ahead of the next stage of the coronavirus, right? You discuss 2 practical steps, right, to stay ahead. So maybe you can share a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And also,
so, Yeah, so I believe that I believe that as the virus grew exponentially, but given the size of the shock, the number of issues, these strange things that I talked about, will grow exponentially too. And the crisis centers that companies have set up are doing phenomenal jobs to do all kinds of things. But I think they're not capable, not set up, not as an individual not capable, but not set up to deal with this complex future. And it's our suggestion that you actually create an effort that helps you plan ahead in multiple time horizons, weeks, months, quarters, years. And that in those timeframes, you plan for multiple futures, your options, your posture, and then maybe moves you should already make today to be ready for some of these possible futures. It's not your long-range trend-based planning. It's event-based planning. You imagine the events that could happen. Government X does this. Competitor X does Y. Supplier X does this. Customer X, this happens. What would you do in that situation? I consider that the size of issues that's coming at the clients. I had just had a conversation with a company of a major consumer goods company just before this call. And he was contemplating the following thing. I asked him, if you think about 6 weeks ago, how many issues were at your table that were big and hairy? He said 2. 3 weeks, 2 weeks. He says 10 this week. I said, this will keep on growing. How are you going to solve that? And that's what we suggest, that you have to have a separate effort to plan ahead, because this crisis with this level of shock will just create some strangeness in the future that you need to get ready for, to also come out better at the end of this road.
Sven, to close, and thank you very much to share some practical advice and for our Latin American leaders of businesses and in general of our societies as we're starting to head into the crisis.
My most practical advice for leaders is, as you have your team set up that do the work, including maybe this plan ahead effort, be in touch with lots of people, government, your teams, your people on the ground, your customers, because to observe in real time what's happening in this enormous innovation of 3 months happening in 2 days. If you're not feeling it on a very direct basis, you're going to mishit lots of things. This is the time to study what's happening around you by interacting with lots of people, also groups of people that you normally would not interact with. I think this platform is one of these platforms to do that, to share and so on. And many of these platforms are emerging, but do it in your value chain, do it with your peers, do it with your surroundings, with your communities, because you will pick up stuff that will be very important to your future decision-making. And you can't do it in a monthly or quarterly study, because the world is just moving too fast. Adopt to this speed, that is phenomenal. Adopt to the size of shock. And practically that means study what's going around very pragmatically, and then take decisive action. Because the speed of the event should over time also dictate the speed of how you're acting. As many people have said, as the virus has dictated how we had to respond from a lockdown perspective, the economic issues will dictate how fast we will need to act as leaders from a leadership in business and institutions. Don't forget the speed at which this event is progressing. It's exponential, and that requires exponential interaction for you and decision-making.
Sven, thank you very much for this insightful conversation, and thank you everyone who has joined on this first session of McKinsey Talks in Spanish Latin America. Tomorrow we'll have a new session with the CEOs of Banco Galicia and BCP and their perspective on the future ahead. Thank you very much. Have a great day. And
thank you.